Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring stands behind the lectern at the Air Ministry building on Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin, at 3 minutes to 11 on the morning of January 30th, 1943. He straightens the papers in front of him. Microphones wait. Somewhere beyond the building, technicians at the Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft prepare to carry his voice into every German home, because today marks 10 years since the Nazi Party seized power, and the Führer himself has sent Göring to deliver the tribute. Rows of Wehrmacht officers sit in their dress uniforms. Flags hang from the ceiling. Outside, Berliners go about their Saturday morning, unaware that 600 miles away, 3 aircraft made almost entirely of wood are already crossing the North Sea at wavetop height, engines howling, navigators counting down the miles. 500 miles away, at 8:45 that same morning, 3 de Havilland Mosquitoes lift off the runway at RAF Marham in Suffolk. Pilot Officer Ted Sismore checks his compass heading, while Squadron Leader Reggie Reynolds settles the aircraft onto its course, the twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines settling into a steady, hypnotic thrum. No Allied aircraft has ever flown over the German capital in daylight before and returned home. The crews know this. They fly the North Sea crossing at wave-top height, low enough that spray from the waves sometimes flecks the windscreen, staying below the reach of German coastal radar until the last possible moment before climbing towards Berlin. At exactly 11 o'clock, air raid sirens tear across the city. The 3 Mosquitoes sweep low over the Haus des Rundfunks and release their bombs. Inside the Air Ministry, Göring's speech collapses into confusion. The broadcast falters. For over an hour, German radio audiences hear nothing but a scratchy gramophone, recording where their Reichsmarshal's voice should be. By the time Göring finally reaches the microphone, 63 minutes late, humiliated in front of the assembled officers of his own Luftwaffe, all 3 Mosquitoes have already turned for home. Not one German fighter has managed to catch them. This is the aircraft that will make Hermann Göring, commander of the most feared air force in Europe, stand up in front of his own aircraft manufacturers and admit, in words he will never live down, that Britain's furniture factories had built something his own industry could not. The story of how that happened begins 2.5 years earlier, in the summer of 1940, in the drawing offices of the de Havilland Aircraft Company at Hatfield, north of London. Britain in 1940 does not have a shortage of aeroplanes so much as a shortage of aluminium. Every Spitfire, every Hurricane, every 4-engined Lancaster draws on the same limited stockpile of light alloy, shipped in convoys across an Atlantic patrolled by German U-boats. The Air Ministry has already drawn up its production priorities, and building an unarmed bomber from wood is not on the list. Geoffrey de Havilland, a 58-year-old engineer who had been building aircraft since before the First World War, proposes exactly that. A twin-engined bomber with no defensive guns at all, relying purely on speed to outrun anything the Luftwaffe can put in the air. The Air Ministry's response is dismissive. Bureaucrats regard the idea as amateurish, a step backwards into an age of biplanes and canvas. Work on the prototype is cancelled outright after the collapse at Dunkirk in June 1940, when every available resource is redirected towards fighter production. De Havilland does not abandon the project. He continues design work using his own company's funds, betting that speed without armament will prove more valuable than armour, and machine guns bolted onto a heavier airframe. The gamble runs directly against official doctrine. Air Ministry specifications of the period call for defensive turrets, multiple gunners and armour plating, on the assumption that any bomber flying deep into German airspace will need to fight its way there and back. De Havilland argues the opposite, that an aircraft too fast to be caught needs none of that weight, and that every gun turret and armoured panel removed is speed added back to the airframe. The aircraft that emerges, the DH-98 Mosquito, is built from a sandwich of Ecuadorian balsa wood between layers of Canadian birch plywood, moulded over concrete forms, and bonded first with casein glue, and later with a synthetic adhesive called aerolite. English ash and spruce provide the structural spars. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines fitted to the Spitfire, give the finished aircraft a top speed of around 415 miles per hour, faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109 sent to intercept it, and considerably faster than the 4-engined Lancasters and Halifaxes it will later fly alongside. When the prototype flies for the first time on 25th November 1940 from a grass airfield at Hatfield in front of a small group of de Havilland engineers and a handful of sceptical Air Ministry observers, it embarrasses every official who dismissed it 18 months earlier. Within months, orders that had once been grudging turn into a production program spanning the entire country. What makes the Mosquito remarkable is not only what it is built from, but who builds it. Aluminium aircraft require skilled sheet metal workers and aircraft-grade machine tools, both in desperately short supply by 1940. A wooden aircraft requires something Britain has in abundance: woodworkers. De Havilland and the Ministry of Aircraft Production begin dispersing Mosquito component manufacture across the country, away from the vulnerable southeast and into workshops that had never built so much as a propeller. Furniture manufacturers retool their benches to shape fuselage formers. Coach builders, who once fitted out luxury motor cars, turn their skills to wing spars. And piano makers, companies that had spent generations bending, gluing, and precisely fitting wood to produce musical instruments, find their craftsmen building the fuselage halves of Britain's fastest bomber. More than 400 British companies are eventually drawn into Mosquito production, alongside roughly 120 subcontractors in Canada, where the workforce assembling the aircraft includes furniture manufacturers, boat builders, farm implement companies, and at least one large automobile maker. Precision woodworking machines built for shaping piano cases and cabinet doors are refitted with aircraft-grade bearings, tightened to tolerances their original owners never imagined they would need. The fuselage itself is built in two vertical halves, each one a sandwich structure of plywood, balsa, and plywood again, formed over a mahogany mould. Equipment and wiring are installed inside each half before the two sides are glued and clamped together, a method borrowed directly from furniture making, rather than aircraft engineering, and one that shaves weeks off assembly time compared with riveted metal construction. Because the labour force is different from that of a conventional aircraft factory, women make up a substantial proportion of the workforce, trained far more quickly in woodworking and gluing techniques than the years required to produce a qualified sheet metal aircraft fitter. Skilled cabinet makers who had spent their careers building wardrobes and dining tables now check glue lines on aircraft destined for Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne, working to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre. The wings, spanning 54 feet, present their own logistical puzzle. In Canada, a farm implement manufacturer takes on the job of building them, its workshops better known for ploughs and threshers than aircraft components, while smaller subcontracting bays turn out fittings and control surfaces piece by piece before shipping them onward for final assembly. A well-known name among the British subcontractors is Parker Knoll, a furniture maker whose upholstered armchairs sat in front rooms across the country before its benches were turned over to aircraft parts. Elsewhere, department stores requisitioned for the war effort find their showroom floors converted into gluing shops, their window displays replaced with jigs holding wing ribs in place, while the adhesive cures. None of these premises were ever designed to build aircraft, and none of the workers walking through their doors each morning had done so before 1940. By the time full production is underway, de Havilland's own Hatfield headquarters functions less as a single factory and more as the final assembly point for a supply chain stretching into hundreds of ordinary British workshops. For the aircrews who fly the finished Mosquito, the experience is unlike anything else in RAF service. Pilot Officer Ted Sisma and Squadron Leader Reggie Reynolds of 105 Squadron, the crew leading the January 1943 raid on Berlin, take off from Marham knowing that no Allied aircraft had ever flown over the German capital in daylight before and returned. The round trip runs to roughly 1,100 miles, over 5 hours of exposure to flak batteries and fighter patrols, flown at wave-top height across the North Sea to stay below German radar before climbing for the final approach on Berlin. The Mosquito carries no rear gunner, no ball turret, no defensive armament of any kind. Its protection is entirely a matter of arriving and leaving faster than the aircraft sent to stop it. German air defence crews face a problem their own engineers cannot immediately solve. Radar stations along the French and Dutch coasts track incoming raids by speed and altitude, and Mosquito crews exploit both, coming in low to avoid detection, and departing fast enough that scrambled fighters rarely close the gap before the bombers cross back over open water. Luftwaffe fighter controllers scramble aircraft from airfields along the raid's likely return path, only to watch their own plots show the Mosquitoes outrunning every interceptor sent up to meet them. Pilots who do manage an intercept frequently report that their own aircraft simply cannot hold the closing speed long enough to bring guns to bear before the wooden bomber has pulled away again. Flak batteries around Berlin, primed for slower, higher-flying heavy bombers, struggle to track a target moving at over 400 miles per hour at rooftop height. Meanwhile, the civilians of Berlin, waking to sirens on a morning meant for celebration, take shelter in the same cellars and U-Bahn stations used during every previous raid, only to discover afterwards that the attacking force numbered just 3 aircraft, an absurdly small raid to have disrupted an entire national broadcast. Wehrmacht officers seated inside the Air Ministry building, dressed for a ceremony rather than an attack, find themselves ushered towards internal corridors while engineers scramble to restore the broadcast signal. For an audience across the Reich, tuned in expecting a triumphant address, the substitute is a scratchy gramophone recording of classical music, looping for over an hour, while technicians work to bring Göring back on air. If this kind of deep dive into overlooked corners of the war appeals to you, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep making them. Later that same afternoon, at 4 o'clock precisely, a second wave of 3 Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron, nicknamed the Jamaica Squadron, arrives over Berlin, just as Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels steps up to address a crowd of thousands at the Sportpalast, Berlin's largest indoor arena. Hitler himself was due to speak but had sent Goebbels in his place, and once again the bombing run is timed to coincide almost exactly with the scheduled broadcast. This second raid proves slightly less disruptive than the morning's attack, but the message has already landed. Of the 6 Mosquitoes sent against Berlin that day, only 1 is lost. Mosquito DK-376, flown by Squadron Leader D.F.W. Darling and Flying Officer W. Wright, who failed to return. The other 5 land safely back in England within hours, their crews debriefed and their aircraft ready to fly again within days. The damage to German morale outstrips anything the bomb loads themselves could achieve. Associated Press reports the following day note that Göring's address was delayed by 1 hour and 3 minutes, an embarrassment broadcast, however unintentionally, into homes across the Reich. German aircraft manufacturers are summoned to explain why the Luftwaffe possesses nothing capable of intercepting a bomber crewed by 2 men and armed with nothing but its own speed. Göring, addressing his own industry figures shortly afterwards, delivers a tirade that becomes one of the most quoted outbursts of the entire war. In 1940, he says, he could fly as far as Glasgow in most of his aircraft, but now he can scarcely cross the North Sea. It makes him furious, he tells them, to see the Mosquito. The British, who can afford aluminium, know better than the Germans, he complains, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and give it a speed that keeps increasing. What, he demands of his own engineers, do they make of that? Britain has the geniuses, he says, and Germany has the nincompoops. The consequences of that admission ripple through German industry for the rest of the war. Luftwaffe procurement officers push German aircraft manufacturers to investigate wooden or composite construction of their own, hoping to replicate the Mosquito's combination of low weight and high speed. German industry, however, lacks the deep pool of civilian furniture and instrument-making capacity that Britain had drawn on, and its own aluminium shortages, while real, had never forced the same wholesale shift in manufacturing culture. Attempts to copy the concept, including later composite designs, arrived too late, and in too few numbers to change the fundamental problem. For the rest of the war, there is no reliable German counter to an aircraft that simply refuses to be caught. Back in Britain, the success over Berlin accelerates an already expanding production program. The Mosquito is adapted into roles far beyond its original bomber concept, a night fighter fitted with airborne radar to hunt German bombers over English cities, a photo reconnaissance aircraft stripped of weapons entirely and flown unarmed over enemy territory at altitudes German fighters struggle to reach, a pathfinder marking targets ahead of heavy bomber streams with coloured flares, a Royal Navy strike aircraft armed with torpedoes and rockets against German shipping, and later a precision strike aircraft capable of hitting individual buildings rather than general areas. It can carry a 4,000-pound bomb load, matching aircraft 4 times its size, while suffering the lowest loss rate of any aircraft type in RAF Bomber Command. Production eventually runs from 1941 until 1950, spreading beyond Britain to assembly lines in Canada and Australia, and drawing in workshops and factories that had never previously built anything more dangerous than a dining chair. The precision that low-level wooden bombers made possible is put to further use in the months and years following the Berlin raid. Mosquito crews strike German communications and administrative targets across occupied Europe, flying missions calculated to the metre rather than the general area, using the aircraft's speed and manoeuvrability to drop bombs against individual buildings, where a heavier raid would have levelled entire city blocks. In Scandinavia, low-level Mosquito attacks target Gestapo offices used for interrogation and record-keeping, hitting the buildings directly rather than the surrounding streets. Such missions demand a degree of accuracy. No four-engined heavy bomber, flying higher and dropping larger, more scattered bomb patterns, could realistically attempt without endangering the same civilians the raid was meant to spare. What changes permanently after January 30th, 1943, is not simply German confidence, but German assumptions about what unarmed fast aircraft could achieve. Before the Berlin raid, speed as a substitute for armour and defensive guns was a theory de Havilland had argued for against Air Ministry scepticism. After it, the theory has flown over the German capital twice, in a single day, and returned home almost unscathed. Military planners on both sides begin reassessing what a bomber actually needs to survive, a question that would echo forward into aircraft design for decades. The Mosquito goes on to strike targets that highlight this new doctrine again and again: low-level precision raids against Gestapo headquarters and prison walls that heavy four-engined bombers, with their wide bombing patterns, could never have attempted without killing the very people they were trying to free. None of it would have happened without the ordinary craftsmen, dismissed by the Air Ministry's initial scepticism as unsuitable for wartime aircraft production. The cabinet makers, coach builders, and piano makers who spent 1941 and 1942 gluing plywood formers and fitting balsa cores had no aviation training when the war began. They had spent their careers building instruments meant to sit quietly in front parlours, producing music rather than delivering bombs. By January 1943, their work was flying over Berlin faster than anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air to stop it. Built to tolerances a piano case demanded, and a bomber, it turned out, needed just as badly. Hermann Göring never did find an answer to the Mosquito. He complains about it again in later addresses to German industry, still furious, still unable to close the speed gap his own engineers cannot match. Meanwhile, in workshops across Britain and Canada, the piano factories keep building, the coach builders keep gluing, and the aircraft born from a rejected proposal and a wartime aluminium shortage keeps flying missions no other bomber in the world could attempt. Back at RAF Marham that Saturday evening, ground crews walk out across the airfield as the light fades to meet the returning Mosquitoes, counting them in against the 3 that left before dawn. 2 aircraft touch down safely, engines cooling in the January air, their crews climbing out stiff after more than 5 hours in the cockpit. The third, DK-376, does not return. Squadron leader Darling and Flying Officer Wright are posted missing. The single loss from 6 aircraft sent against the German capital that day, across the squadron records without ceremony, alongside a mission already being spoken of as one of the most audacious of the war. Somewhere in the Berlin archives, the recording of Göring's interrupted speech still exists. 63 minutes of dead air and scratchy gramophone music, where a triumphant 10th anniversary address should have been. A silence built in the end by furniture makers, coach builders, and piano craftsmen who had never built an aeroplane before the war forced them to.